listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. President Biden's foreign policy has been an unmitigated disaster, and we're going to talk about this with our guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author and a historian, doctor, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Larry Johnson is a retired CIA intelligence officer, and he said, I will quote, he said, U.S. diplomacy is this: do what we tell you to do, or we're going to impose sanctions. That's not how you win friends and influence enemies. It's just someone who's going to order people about as if they are personal servants. It's not going to get respect, and it's going to have people working against them if they can. I think that's the situation that we are in. And I think it's even worse because we ain't just going to impose sanctions. The U.S. is more like the mafia. Do what we tell you to do, or we'll kill you and take your stuff. Dr. Horne, your thoughts on the foreign policies of one Joe Biden?
Well, obviously, it's a disaster, but we have to approach it from both the individual point of view and the structural point of view. With regard to the latter, a major problem of Mr. Biden's Democratic Party is that a major constituency, speaking of the Black American constituency, is missing in action with regard to foreign policy. That has a lot to do with the fact that when Jim Crow was eroded 70 plus years ago, part of the bargain was to throw overboard Black critics of U.S. foreign policy, Paul Robeson in the first instance. And since that time, there has been spasmodic and intermittent critiques of U.S. foreign policy, but nothing consistent. Then there's the question of labor, the other pillar of the Democratic Party. I salute Sean Fain, United Auto Workers, who are on strike against the big three automakers. But the UAW needs to do some self-criticism because it was under the former UAW leader, Leonard Woodcock, who was appointed ambassador to China some decades ago, that you saw a mass migration of U.S. plants across the Pacific to Asia, to China, more specifically helping to create this juggernaut. And then there's the U.S. ruling elite, which is not able to impose discipline upon its members. I'm thinking now of the potent Israeli lobby, which has demonized James A. Baker III, of all people, a card-carrying member of the U.S. ruling class, former Secretary of State under the first Mr. Bush, George H.W. Bush, but who has been demonized by the Israeli lobby because they didn't like his position with regard to Israel-Palestine, which, of course, brings us to that current crisis where we now get into the foibles of Mr. Biden, who has sent the flotilla of the U.S. Navy off the coast of Israel. There is an imminent possibility that the United States will be involved in a shooting war in that crisis-ridden part of the world. Obviously, there's a drumbeat of propaganda unfolding as we speak that would lead to a U.S. attack on Iran, which is being scapegoated for the Hamas attack on Israel. And that kind of attack on Iran would open the gates of hell. So on the one hand, there's a structural problem with regard to the Democratic Party and the ruling class in U.S. foreign policy. But then there are the individual foibles and weaknesses of one Joseph R. Biden. I'm thinking of that helter-skelter retreat from Afghanistan in August 2021, an absolute debacle. I'm thinking of his lack of flexibility with regard to negotiating with Russia pre-February 2022, issuing assurances that, yes, the United States would be opposed to Ukraine entering NATO, and that, yes, the United States would adhere to the previous agreement that NATO would not be creeping an inch eastward, which, of course, they have failed to uphold. And then there's policy towards Cuba. Mr. Biden could have pursued the policy of his Democratic Party predecessor, Mr. Obama, but instead he's doubled down on the backwards retrograde Trump foreign policy. Likewise, in Latin America, he has opened the door to all of this loose talk about attack on Mexico, obviously without Mexico's permission, supposedly because of this drug crisis Of course, Mexico has its own complaints about the United States in terms of this river of iron, these guns and weapons that are shipped promiscuously into Mexico from the United States of America. And then there's Southern Africa. Once again, Mr. Biden could have shown goodwill by easing or lifting sanctions towards Zimbabwe. He has not done so. In fact, he's worsened relations with Zimbabwe's neighbors, speaking of South Africa, including this ill-considered remark by his ambassador in Pretoria, who suggested that South Africa was sending military materiel to Russia, for which Russia would use on the battlefield of Ukraine, which turned out to be obviously a fabrication at best. And then there are his policies towards Northeast Africa. The breaking news is that his Democratic Party colleague, Senator Menendez, is now facing a superseding indictment charging that he was a paid agent of Egypt. But in some ways, Mr. Menendez could argue that he was only seeking to implement the foreign policy of Mr. Biden, which has tipped the scales in favor of Egypt and against that of Egypt's intermittent antagonist, speaking of Ethiopia. With regard to Niger, the Biden administration has just declared the events there to be a coup, which by U.S. law will call for a U.S. retreat from Niger. But I had thought that the U.S. policy in that part of Africa was to try to elbow France aside and cozy up to the anti-French neocolonial regimes. But I guess I was mistaken. And speaking of France, what about that debacle involving the United States elbowing France aside and scooping up a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal to the consternation of France? And speaking of that part of the world in general, what about his policy towards Armenia? That is to say, this small former Soviet republic has been historically close not only to the Soviet Union, but to Russia. But in recent weeks and months, Mr. Biden has sent high-level U.S. officials to Yerevan, the capital, giving them encouragement that they would have backup in terms of their ongoing conflict with Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh. But alas, that proved to be fallacious, and now you see the routing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh to the consternation of Armenia. And then there's Canada. Not only the fact that Mr. Biden did not castigate Ottawa for that disgusting, despicable display in Parliament where they gave a standing ovation to a former Nazi, or I should say an ongoing Nazi, but also not necessarily putting distance between Ottawa and Washington after Prime Minister Trudeau, obviously a tyro and a neophyte and a novice, who charged New Delhi with executing a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. All this is taking place against the backdrop of Mr. Biden saying that China is the big enchilada, China is the ball game, but yet this foregoing litany of foreign policy debacles obviously compromises the ability of U.S. imperialism to confront China, which, of course, was magnified just this past week when Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was in Beijing, bending the knee on the one hand with regard to his meeting with President Xi Jinping, and on the other hand, having the gall and the temerity to castigate China for not adopting the pro-Israeli position on the crisis now unfolding in historic Palestine. The Biden foreign policy, on the one hand, is incoherent, but at the same time, it's part of a larger incoherence that's embedded in the heart of the Democratic Party.
King Charles will travel to Kenya later this month for a state visit, Buckingham Palace said Wednesday, in a trip that is full of symbolism. Charles' mother, and this is interesting, Charles' mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, learned that she had become UK monarch while visiting a game preserve in the East African nation in 1952. They left out a lot of other stuff that was going on in Kenya in 1952. But your thoughts on the symbolism that they speak of with Prince Charles returning to Kenya?
Well, King Charles should be picketed for every minute he's on Kenyan soil, because what you're alluding to is the reign of terror inflicted by Britain in that part of Africa pre-independence 1963, involving the so-called Mau Mau revolt, involving torture of Kenyan men, women, and children. I should also say that, a la most of the British escapades and quagmires in recent years, U.S. imperialism was implicated in that disaster in Kenya. At the same time, of course, as these folks are protesting King Charles's visit, they should also protest their own government, which is now enmeshed in the possibility that they may be sending Kenyan police forces to Haiti, even though, of course, the Kenyan police have a well-merited reputation for being masters of disaster, that is to say, masters of human rights crimes against their own people. One can imagine what they'll do in Haiti. But at the same time, of course, King Charles should be forced to apologize. Not only forced to apologize, but also forced to give and sign on to a pledge for reparations to those Africans and their descendants who his forces terrorized for years pre-independence 1963.
And speaking of Niger, Niger military rulers ordered the UN officials out within 72 hours. They've ordered the United States coordinator to leave the country within 72 hours, blaming the world body for hindering international recognition of the post-coup regime. Your thoughts?
Well, that is understandable. Recall that we just had the meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. The new regime in Niamey wanted to send a representative there to use that platform, that bully pulpit, to explain what was going on in their country, but they were blocked by the French neo-colonialists and their U.S. sidekicks. It's understandable why the new regime in Niamey is upset with the United Nations, but I'm afraid to say that the United Nations is not living up to its mandate to be a forum for the international community. It's trying to convert itself under Secretary General Guterres into yet another placeman for U.S. imperialism and the North Atlantic powers more generally. You see this with regard to the mealy-mouthed statements being issued from the United Nations with regard to these depredations now being inflicted upon Gaza by the Israelis, who say that they will not listen to the United Nations. The United Nations should be prosecuting the Israelis and pushing cases in the International Criminal Court, in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, should also be knocking together resolutions at the Security Council to impose sanctions upon this outlaw regime in Israel. But instead, you see them being complicit with the North Atlantic powers in trying to flummox and block the new regime in Niger. It's understandable why the new regime in Niamey is upset.
We only got about a minute, but Senegalese president has dismissed his government ahead of a power shuffle. Your thoughts? We only got about a minute and a half.
Well, Macky Sall, the leader of Senegal, has come under fire in his West African nation, not only because of his crackdown on the opposition, but also because it seems like he's trying to style himself as some sort of international peacemaker, going into Ukraine and even Russia, supposedly trying to mediate that dispute. His constituency back home in Dakar wonders when he's going to apply his peacemaking skills to dealing with the opposition in his own country. Likewise, it has been suggested that if there had been an economic community of West African states intervention in Niger to overthrow the new regime, that Senegal would have joined with Nigeria in that escapade that would only have ended in tears. So, once again, Mr. Macky Sall, the president, really needs to stick to his domestic knitting more so than contemplating foreign interventions or even foreign peacemaking for that matter.
We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, and a researcher.